Green. Good.
Oh, we're on? Okay, fantastic. All right, we'll make a start. Ruthlessly punctual. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for coming along tonight to this presentation, which we're all looking forward to. I'm looking forward to. I hope you're looking forward to it. It should be fantastic. This is a presentation named Making Sense and Finding Purpose, the Science of Meaning in Life. My name is Professor John Rees. I am the discipline lead of psychology here at the Melbourne campus, which means I'm the senior psychology academic at the Melbourne campus. I'm tonight's MC, so I'll be introducing our speaker and also running the questions at the end of the session. I'm joined by Cassie Watson, manning the computer over there. Cassie is the Melbourne Campus Industry and Alumni Advisor and RAP Project Officer, who's the host for our online audience, which is about 200, Cassie?
Yeah.
About 200 people, which is fantastic. So between the 200 people there and the 50 or so people here, welcome. You're very, very welcome to this presentation. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on here tonight, the Wurundjeri people who form part of the Eastern Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Extend that respect to any First Nations people who may be with us here today or online. And extend that respect to anybody who may engage with this material now and into the future. Before we start, Cassie will email any attendance certificates, and she'll also email the presentation slides in the next week or two. If you have any questions, online people, you will have the opportunity to ask them in the Q&A slot of the webinar. Of course, people here, you can just stick up your hand and you'll be able to ask questions at the end of the presentation. All right, that's just the housekeeping stuff for tonight. I now want to introduce our presenter, Andrew Napier. Andrew is an associate lecturer in psychology here at ACAP. Andrew's currently completing his PhD at the Centre for Wellbeing Science at the University of Melbourne. I've known Andrew for a number of years. Andrew was an ACAP student. He had a life before ACAP, but he studied psychology as an ACAP student and came here as a first-year student here on the Melbourne campus. I taught Andrew in several classes, several units throughout his degree. Andrew was an outstanding student. He's going to blush when I tell you this, but he actually won the ACAP prize or the ACAP medal, I can't remember what it was called, for the most outstanding student in the college. That's not in psychology, that's across the entire college, across all campuses. So that's how good he was as a student. After he finished his undergraduate degree in psychology with us, he went to do his honours degree in psychology at La Trobe. And now he is back at ACAP. He's been working for us as an associate lecturer for a couple of years now and doing a wonderful job with his teaching. But he's also completing his PhD at the University of Melbourne. Andrew's PhD focuses on developing an intervention called life crafting, to help young adults live a more meaningful life and satisfy their basic psychological needs. Some of you may know that positive psychology is a very strong movement in modern psychological science. Psychology, until the positive psychology movement came along, had a reputation of being rather problem-saturated and problem-focused. And the positive psychology movement, led by people like Martin Seligman and other collaborators, really changed that direction, or has attempted to change that direction to focus on positive aspects of flourishing in the human condition. And Andrew is very much doing research in that vein. Andrew is interested in ways to help people live a more self-determined life. So he's going to tell us about his PhD research, and I'd like you to welcome Andrew to the podium, please.
Thank you, John, and thank you for that introduction. I was going to introduce myself and talk about positive psychology, but John's already done a fantastic job of that. So just to kind of bounce off what John said, I am doing my research in at the Centre for Wellbeing Science, so what is often referred to as positive psychology. And like John said, it is really the area of psychology that's been popping up in the last 20 years that's really trying to understand what goes well in life rather than just what goes wrong with people and mental illnesses. And there's a whole, you can have a whole unit. In fact, we have a unit on positive psychology here. We could talk about all the different facets that lead to flourishing for a long time. But one of the areas that has been a focus of positive psychology, certainly in the last 10 years, is a sense of meaning. So I'm going to kind of narrow down and focus on that tonight. So most of the talk will be on the general concept of meaning, and then I'll talk a bit about my PhD research at the end as a bit of a practical, I guess, explanation of some of the concepts. So a lot of people think, when you talk about meaning in life, they say, well, isn't that a completely subjective thing? Meaning is, what you think it is. And in a sense, it absolutely is. If you think something is meaningful, and if you say this gives my life meaning, I can't tell you otherwise. I can't say, no, that's wrong. It doesn't give you meaning. So it is very subjective. But there's still a lot, I think, that science and psychology can offer for us in terms of trying to understand this really broad, really abstract concept that is meaning. So most of tonight is going to be trying breaking down what meaning is. What do we mean? What do psychologists mean? We as psychologists have only really worked it out in the last 10 years, or kind of landed on an agreed concept of it. But now we have agreed on it, and everyone in this area is like, yep, I think that's it. So we're going to talk about that. And then, like I said, at the end, we're going to get a bit more practical in terms of some ways that we might foster meaning either for yourself, or if anyone here works with clients in psychology or coaching, then hopefully some of these will be fairly practical tips. So what I want to start with is just really quickly, we don't have too much time, but 30 seconds, either by yourself, for those at home, you can note it down, or you can just think about it. For those here, if you're with somebody, just chat with them for 30 seconds. I want you to think about what is the first thing that comes to your mind when I ask what gives your life meaning. So literally just 30 seconds. What's the first thing that comes to your mind that gives your life meaning? All right, I'll cut you off. I'm sure you could talk about that all night. If anyone is happy to share, hold on to it. Later on, we're going to come back to it. And I'd love to hear if anyone online is putting in the chat box, please continue. If anyone here wants to later on, you can share what came to your mind. So hold on to that thought. So I'm going to start this talk, like any good talk, talking about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If anyone's read this book or seen the film, there's a very famous joke in there about the meaning of life. Does anyone remember what the answer to the meaning of life is? 42. So obviously the joke being that, this grand question, they ask a supercomputer, the smartest computer in the world, what the meaning of life is. And it says, after years of deliberation, the answer is 42. And the joke, of course, is that is an absurd answer to this question. But I actually think partly we find that funny because it's also, we know it's a bit of an absurd question in the first place, that there is this one question that has a single answer, and that answer is going to apply to everyone in the universe. So the question of the meaning of life has been around for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. It's usually associated with religions. The many different religions will say, what is the meaning of life? And the answer will often be something about serving God or whatever. And philosophers have also started asking that question. And, the existential philosophers really started asking about what is the meaning of life as well? Can we answer that philosophically? And most of them came to the pretty grim realization there is no meaning in life, and we're all going to die. So it was a pretty psychologists started thinking about this as well. So they realized, well, this is a really interesting topic. We'd like to get in on this, but they realized the meaning of life is not a very psychological or scientific question. So psychology does use the scientific method. And so psychologists thought, well, that's not a question we should be asking. So they did a really clever thing, is they started asking a slightly different question, which is, how do people find meaning in their lives? And it might seem like a very tiny thing, but they, by asking that slightly different question, we are now actually not looking at this general question of what the meaning of life is, like there's going to be a single answer to that, but they can now start interrogating what this concept of meaning even is. And that's a really interesting question that we can answer by using scientific and psychological methods. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is this. We're talking about the meaning that people develop and establish in their lives. We're not going to come away with any answer to the meaning of life. So the first person in psychology that really started talking about this was a man called Viktor Frankl. Some of you might have heard of him. He wrote a very famous book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he was a psychiatrist who was also captured by the Nazis and got taken into the concentration camps during World War II. And he noticed something while he was in there, which was that a lot of people, of course, were dying, but even the ones that weren't being taken to the gas chambers were often dying. So a lot of his camp, the other people in the camp with him were just giving up, and often they would just not be alive the next day. And he was wondering, why were some people just giving up? Their bodies were just saying, I can't do this anymore. And others were resilient and were pushing through, him being one of them. So of course he ended up getting out. And what he started thinking is that the people that were surviving, the people that were able to continue living, apart from the luck of not being taken, were because they had this purpose. They had something that was giving their life meaning, and that was able to kind of push them forward and drive them forward. So he thought that he called this the will to meaning, which is this kind of need that every human has to find some kind of purpose or meaning in their life. And he himself had a pretty big purpose. He came into the camp with a manuscript for a book. He had an idea that he wanted to develop, and he got taken off him. The manuscript was taken off him by the Nazis. So he had this kind of drive to get out, to help people, to help the people in the camp while he was there, not to mention everyone else he could help afterwards, which he did. Like I said, he got out and he developed what he went on to call logotherapy, which is literally meaning-centered therapy. So this is back in Freudian times when, most therapists were saying, well, the only thing we have to do is look at your repressed sexual urges. And he said, no, we need to also look at what gives your life meaning. So he was really one of the first people to take this idea that just because there isn't a religious meaning of life doesn't mean we can't help people find meaning in life. And he is a very influential name in this area. That's the book. If anyone's interested in this area, it's a very accessible read. It's about 100 pages. It's pretty grim. It does go through his time in the camps, but it's a really, really good read. And I love this quote. This quote really stood out to me. It did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life and instead to think of ourselves as those who are being questioned by life daily and hourly. Our answer must consist not in talk and meditation, but in right action and right conduct. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. I think that quote captures beautifully this idea of us kind of taking responsibility to find the meaning in our life, just because there isn't one broad meaning of life. So another thinker, really influential psychologist who came after Frankl, Irvin Yalom. Again, anyone who's studying counseling or psychology might have come across him. This is another fantastic book, much denser than the last one. So if you are interested, I'd maybe go with Frankl's work first. But this book is really, really interesting. And Yalom made a really interesting point when he was talking about meaning. So he was also a therapist. He also saw a lot of people that had issues with the lack of meaning or purpose. But he made an interesting point that looking for meaning is a bit of a modern problem. People in pre-industrial societies didn't really have that problem because they didn't really have time to ask the question. But if they did, pretty much all of their life was based around meaningful things anyway. They lived close to nature. They were growing their own food. They had intrinsically worthwhile work. They had unambiguous social roles. They had strong belonging to groups and religious adherence, and they were, raising children. So pretty much everything that gives life meaning, they were just doing naturally. And what he realized is that in the modern world, this is the 1980s when he was writing this, all of the people that he was seeing were living in what he called this existential vacuum. They didn't have access to all of these naturally meaningful things. And so it led to boredom, apathy, emptiness, lack of direction. And again, he was seeing a lot of this in his clients. So he echoed Frankl when he said, we have to make our own meaning. So he really helped his clients trying to find and develop that meaning in their life that they were lacking. So what are some benefits of feeling that your life is meaningful? So this was work by Michael Steger, who's a really prominent researcher in this field. And he reviewed a bunch of different studies that looked at the relationship between meaning and other really positive traits. You have to remember, these are all correlational. So we just ask people how meaningful your life is using different questionnaires, and then we ask them a bunch of other questions. But there's a lot of really good findings. People that say their life is more meaningful, they have higher positive emotions, they are more happy, better, higher life satisfaction, they adjust better to traumatic events. People with cancer have a higher quality of life, more self-esteem, self-acceptance, self-actualization. People with more meaning typically have higher levels of hope. They're more optimistic about the world. And typically they're more spiritual as well, both in a religious sense, but also in a secular sense. I'll talk a bit more about self-transcendence in a moment. They also have a lot less negative outcomes. So people who rate their lives as more meaningful, very consistently, we find that there's a negative correlation with depression. So depression and meaning, it's a pretty strong effect, and they go in the opposite direction. The more meaning you have, or say that you have, the less you'll say you're depressed. They have lower negative emotions. They ruminate less anxiety. They're even less antisocial and abuse substance less. So the more we think of our lives as meaningful, the more, all of these kind of positive traits are associated with it. But what do we even mean by meaning? So like I said, psychologists really wanted to ask this question and really get to the bottom of it. And like I said, this is also what I'm going to spend a lot of time nitpicking and getting to the bottom of, because I think it'll really help us make sense of this really abstract word, meaning. So the first thing to think about or to remember is that meaning is not unidimensional. It's not just one thing. It's actually made up of lots of different concepts or several different concepts. So work by Paul Wong and Gary Recker back in the 80s, they were some of the early researchers to start looking into this. And they realized that there were at least 3 elements that are important when we talk about meaning. One is that it's a cognitive part. So it's about how we think of our life. One is it's motivational. So part of meaning is about how it directs our attention and directs us towards certain things. And then one is affective, which is what psychologists mean when they talk about emotion. So one is emotional. So it's about how we feel about our life. And this is the model that they kind of came up with, that they all kind of 3 of them work side by side. So for the next 30 odd years, psychologists were kind of arguing and talking about, oh, it's this and it's that, and it's maybe 2 of those 3, or maybe it's 1 of those 3, until eventually 2016, for some reason, 2 separate groups of researchers landed on this in the same, they reviewed all the literature, and there's 2 separate papers that kind of reviewed exactly the same stuff. And they came out and they landed on what we pretty much all agree on now, which is what we call the tripartite model of meaning. Tripartite being 3. I love this definition from Frank Martella and Michael Steger. We define meaning in life as emerging from the web of connections, interpretations, aspirations, and evaluations that, 1, make our experiences comprehensible. So we call this coherence. Direct our efforts towards desired futures. We call it purpose. And then provide a sense that our lives are matter and are worthwhile. We call it significance or mattering. And you can see that they actually line up with those 3 things in terms of coherence is how we think, the cognitions we have. Purpose is the motivation, it directs us towards things. And then significance is how we feel. It's the emotions we attach to our life. So I'm going to go into each of these in detail to really look at what we mean when we talk about each of these 3 elements. So let's start with purpose. This is probably the most common thing that people associate when they talk about meaning. In fact, it's often used interchangeably. People say, oh, meaning and purpose. But now we kind of think of purpose as one of the elements within meaning. So purpose really is a passion. It's a passion to do something worthwhile, something that you really want to do, that fulfills you. You know, it's a reason to get out of bed in the morning, essentially. To give you a more academic definition, purpose is a central self-organizing life aim that organizes and stimulates goals, manages behavior, and provides a sense of meaning. So if we break that definition down, it's central. It means our purpose is really, really important to our identity. It's not something that's just, you know, something we think about occasionally. This is something that is really, really deeply part of our authentic identity. It's self-organizing, so it really helps to direct our attention. So if you have a sense of purpose, then it gives you the guidance, I suppose, to say, well, I'm going to spend some time and resources on this, but not on that. And I don't have infinite resources, so I should dedicate it more to this and less to that. And it's a life aim. It's not something that can ever be achieved. We don't achieve a purpose necessarily. It's this kind of overarching framework that guides our goals. So in that sense, purpose and goals are not the same thing. But to visualize it a bit better, this is how I'd like to think of purpose. So at the top, the most important thing really is what's going to guide our purpose is our values. What do we find valuable? And I'm going to come back to values as a really, really important part of meaning in life in different areas tonight. That gives us a sense of purpose. That'll then guide our more higher order goals, and those will guide our more lower goals. And again, it's a bit abstract, so let's make that a bit more specific. Let's take an example. One of my values is justice. Let's say that's a really important thing to me. So my purpose then will be to help people in need. All right, that's going to be something that I want to do. And you can see this is not something we ever achieve. I can never say, tick, I've helped everyone in the world, done, purpose has been achieved, right? So that's something that's always going to be there. You'll always be able to help somebody else. And that's then going to guide your broader goals. So you might decide I want to volunteer at a women's shelter. I might donate to some charities. And then that's going to guide our more specific goals. I might, you know, contact the shelter, do some research, blah, blah, blah. So these two levels of goals, we can achieve them. They're things that we can tick off, but our purpose is something that's always there underneath, kind of guiding our goals. So a question you might ask then is, should we only focus on our own needs, or how about focusing on other people's needs? So this is another definition, comes from Will Damon and his colleagues, who also do quite a lot of research in purpose. And they define purpose as a stable and generalized intention to accomplish something that is once meaningful to the self and of consequence to the world beyond the self. So and I think this is really important to distinguish the difference between self-oriented, so it's pretty much what we just talked about, you know, focusing on your own values, your own skills, your own character strengths, versus beyond the self-oriented. So this is where we contribute to something larger than the self. And again, this is what we often talk about when we say self-transcendence. I'll come back to that a few times. So self-transcendence or beyond the self can be lots of things. It might be a job. How does your job contribute to other people? You know, as a teacher, I get to contribute to teaching people about these really interesting ideas every single day. And so that's a really, it gives me a sense of purpose. Might be being part of a cause. It might be volunteering. It might be helping preserve the natural environment. There's lots of things where we can direct our attention to something that is not just our own needs, but other people's needs, or even the environment's needs. Can we have too many purposes? Yes, we can. We can definitely have more than one. Purpose is not a single thing. But if we have too many of them, remember, it's about directing your resources. So if you think, well, I've got 20 purposes, then you're probably not going to have enough time in the day to actually direct your time, your money, and all of your personal resources to doing all of them. So you kind of, you know, you want to find that sweet spot, I suppose. So another question that people often ask when we talk about good goals, what are the kind of goals we want to pursue, is, are all goals created equal? Is any goal that you want to work towards valuable and worthwhile and is going to give you a sense of purpose? And some people have said, yep, doesn't matter. As long as you want to work towards it, great, it'll give you purpose. But researchers in self-determination theory, one of the leading theories in psychology and motivation, have actually said no. It really depends on why you're pursuing the goal and what type of goal you're pursuing. And they have said, and they've got a bit of research to support this, that if you're pursuing goals for the wrong reason or the wrong type of goals, it can be detrimental to your sense of meaning. So let's look at the why and the what. I'm going to try and break this down. This is a pretty complex theory, but I'll try and simplify it. The why is essentially a spectrum of why we do things. Why are we motivated to pursue things? On the low end, we can be motivated because we feel controlled and pressured by other things outside of us. And on the higher end, it's because we're more autonomous. We're doing it for our own reasons. So we can be motivated to pursue a goal simply for external rewards. If I hate my job, but I'm only here because it pays me a lot of money, that would be down that low end there. We can also pursue goals because we feel internal pressure. We feel a sense of guilt or pride, or we should be doing it. The shoulds is what comes up a lot in people when they talk about why they pursue things. So it's a little bit better, but it's not a really autonomous goal. When we start getting a bit higher up, we can pursue things for personal value. Again, we come back to values. Why are we doing it? Because we think it's important. And the highest level of motivation in the sense of autonomy is intrinsic motivation. We're doing it simply because we love it, right? It just feels good. It's enjoyable. There's no other reason, but I love doing it. And so self-determination theory would say that these goals, which we call self-concordant, they're in line with your values and interests, are the type of goals that are going to contribute to a sense of purpose, much more than these goals down the bottom end. What about the what? What type of goals are we pursuing is also important. And this has been quite controversial because a lot of people have said, again, it doesn't matter what goal you pursue as long as you enjoy pursuing it. But there is some research showing that actually if you pursue different types of goals, it can be less impactful on your sense of purpose. So we can talk about intrinsic goals versus extrinsic goals. So intrinsic goals are types of things that are good in and of themselves. It's not because they lead to something, they're just worthwhile in and of themselves. So relationships, community contribution, health, personal growth. If somebody asks me why I'm doing that, I just say, because it's good. You know, there's not really a follow-up answer to why I'm doing it. It's just a really good thing for a human to do. Whereas extrinsic goals are these types of goals that typically lead to something else. They're a means to an end. So, you know, wealth, popularity, a nice image, power. I think wealth is a great example, money, because money typically leads us to do something. What does that money allow us to do? And I think the confusion a lot of people end up getting themselves in is seeing money as an intrinsic end in itself, rather than what it allows you to do with that money. So what's the commonality between these two, why and what, the autonomous reasons and the intrinsic types of goals? It's that they satisfy our basic psychological needs. This is a central kind of element of self-determination theory, that every human being has 3 psychological needs. And there are literally thousands of studies now supporting this as important to both well-being and a sense of meaning. So firstly, we need to feel autonomous. We need to feel in control of our own goals and that we're choosing them based on our own values and interests. We need to feel competent, that when we are achieving these goals, that, you know, we're actually hitting the milestones, we're not constantly failing. And we need to feel related. We need to feel connected and like we belong to a group. So I always like to come back to these basic psychological needs. If your sense of purpose is not meeting these needs, you're probably not going to be feeling that it's a sense of purpose at all. And last thing on purpose is, again, what are some relationships? What are some benefits of purpose? Well, we can talk about searching for a sense of purpose versus having a sense of purpose. When you ask people if they're searching for purpose, typically that's related in a negative sense, a negative correlation with life satisfaction. So the more they say they're searching, the lower their satisfaction, which kind of makes sense. You know, if you're searching for something, probably means you want it, but you don't have it. Interestingly, when we ask young adults, there's a positive correlation between searching for meaning and life satisfaction. The more they're searching, the happier they are, which suggests that that's actually part of the kind of development of an adult identity, that you actually want to be going through the stage of searching for something that you find really meaningful and then landing on it. But if you haven't landed on it by the time you're in your 50s and 60s, that's when we find the negative correlation. When we ask people about the presence of purpose, they typically have more grit. So they have higher self-regulation. They're more likely to, you know, push through and achieve their goals, which makes sense. You've got this overarching goal or purpose you're working towards. They have more hope and optimism. They're more resilient. They bounce back from stresses more quickly. And they have less health issues. And even one study found lower mortality. People died less when they had more purpose. And partly this might be explained, we don't really know, but it might be explained by their health behaviors. Maybe they're just eating more healthily and sleeping more and exercising more. All right, that's purpose. Let's look at the next one, which is a sense of coherence.
So can I turn the light down here?
Turn the lights down. Cassie, can we turn the... Sorry, we've got to keep on. Yeah.
Sorry.
Can everyone, is that coming? Is the screen coming through all right? Yeah. Yeah. So what do these four pictures have in common? Does anyone want to have a guess what 9/11, the space, the moon landing, Princess Diana and JFK have in common? Sorry?
Yeah.
Death? Yeah. Partly. Not sure if anyone died on the moon. Attention, like public attention. Yep. Partly. Yep.
Cultural moments.
Cultural moments. Yep.
They're all used in flashbulb memory experiments.
That's a very psychological answer, John.
Conspiracy, grief.
They nailed it. Whoever said conspiracies nailed it. So they are all famous conspiracy theories, right? So 9/11 was an inside job. Moon landing was faked. Princess Di and JFK were assassinated by someone in the government. I'm sure there's other ones. These are the first ones that came to mind. Why am I talking about conspiracy theories? I think it's a really good example of humans' need to have a sense of coherence. So coherence is about making sense of life, right? So this, if I had to summarize it in 2 words, making sense is the best way to summarize what we mean by coherence. Humans have a need to see that experiences in life fit together like a puzzle, right? We want to see patterns. And ultimately, we have a pretty deep need to feel that life isn't random, chaotic, and unpredictable. I think most of us can feel that if life was unpredictable and random and it didn't make sense, it wouldn't be nice, right? So we have this pretty deep need to feel that life makes sense. Roy Baumeister, one of the leading social psychologists, he's done a lot of work on meaning in life. And he raised a really good point in a book he wrote back in the 90s that we have what he calls the myth of higher meaning, which is essentially saying that this sense of coherence is a bit of an illusion, that we have these kind of unrealistic assumptions that, you know, the world does make sense, even though when we think about it, we probably know it doesn't. It can be pretty random and chaotic. So he said we have the myth of completeness, everything, you know, we think everything has to make sense all of the time. The, you know, myth of consistency, there's always an answer and the answers never contradict each other. So everything just makes sense perfectly and there's no contradiction. Myth of stability, that everything, you know, the rules, these ideas, patterns, they're always the same, they never change. And the myth of fulfillment, people want to be happy and fulfilled all the time, they never want to feel bad. Now, don't worry too much about the details of those. I think the point he's trying to make is that humans want the world to make sense, even though we kind of know when we stop and think about it, the world doesn't really make sense. It can be pretty random and chaotic. And so just think about that maybe this sense of meaning, at least in the form of coherence, is a bit of an illusion. But it's a positive illusion, I think. So we're going to look at 2 areas of research on coherence. Probably the most well-researched area on this is how people make sense of their lives after they've had a really negative or even traumatic experience. And then the less researched one, but certainly starting to grow in the last 10 years, is the life narratives, the stories people tell about themselves. So Ronnie Janoff-Bullman, she's a psychologist who spent most of her life studying and interviewing people who've been through traumatic experiences. And she came up with a really interesting idea that from all of the things she spoke to people, she realized that there was 3, what she called assumptions that we all have about how the world works. We have, and these are pretty unconscious. Again, if you think about them, you think, well, that's not true, but they're kind of pretty unconscious. We believe the world is generally good, but people don't want to hurt us and harm us. We believe things happen for a reason, and we believe that we're good human beings. We deserve love, so we, you know, self-esteem. And then when you have a negative event, especially something quite traumatic, it can shatter those assumptions. She literally wrote a book called Shattered Assumptions. And the idea being is that if you depending on how you attribute a specific event. So let's say something really bad happens to you and it was really threatening, you felt out of control. So you think, oh, that event was really bad. Then that event can cause an issue with your general assumption. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm walking down the street, I get mugged, I go to hospital, I'm quite badly injured, but I believe generally people are good and I don't deserve to be hurt and things happen for a reason. So why did something bad happen to me? I didn't deserve it. So my general assumptions and the thing that happened to me have come in conflict. So if there's a discrepancy, or if there's no discrepancy, great. Then you adjust to that, you move on, you bounce back. But what a lot of the people she spoke to is that there was a discrepancy between those two things, what they believed in general and what actually happened to them. And that's when they get this distress, post-traumatic stress disorder, certainly one of the outcomes. And then they need to start making sense of it. So she called it meaning making, and people take part in it. And so Crystal Park reviewed lots of the different ways that people try to make this meaning after the event has happened. What do they do to try and get those assumptions back in line to try and make sense of their life again? So firstly, a lot of people just try to answer the question, why me? And they might not come up with a great answer, but they might, they'll often go through this process of just saying, why did this happen to me and not someone else? A lot of times people will try to make a causal attribution. They'll try to explain something happened which caused it. So a couple of examples. If someone dies of lung cancer, what's the first thing we're going to think of? Oh, they probably smoked a pack of cigarettes a day. That's why they died of lung cancer. As long as I don't smoke a pack of cigarettes a day, I won't die of lung cancer. So we try to look at these causal explanations. It's also why we often see victim blaming, or even the victims themselves will blame themselves because they're trying to make sense of it. They're trying to say, well, if that person hadn't walked down the dark alleyway at the middle of the night, they wouldn't have gotten, mugged. So if I don't do that, then I won't get mugged either. Some people just accept it. Acceptance is a really powerful thing to just say, yep, that did happen, and I'm going to move on. And in the same way, we can also try to integrate it into who we are. So say, again, that happened to me. I don't love that it happened, but I'm going to make that part of my story and we're going to move through it. And this is often why people recover from PTSD, is because they help to integrate it into their identity. We can also learn from it. We can grow. We can understand and say, well, actually, I got something from it that I didn't have before the event. We often refer to this as post-traumatic growth. We can say we suffered for a reason. There was a sense of purpose in it. I suffered, because something good came out of it. And again, you can kind of see that link back to purpose as well. Or we can reappraise it. We can downplay it. We can look at it as less negative. We can compare ourselves to people who were worse off than us and say, well, I might have broken my leg in the car accident, but that person was paralyzed. So these are all ways that we can try to make sense of the world after something bad happens. But some of you might think, okay, great. So the only way I can have a sense of coherence is have a traumatic event happen to me. No, we can definitely make sense of our life in general. And this leads me to the second area of research, by far a lot less research on this, but this is about the stories we tell about ourselves. So humans are natural storytellers. We've told stories ever since the beginning of time, or beginning of humans, and we tell stories about us as our lives just as much. So we call this narrative identity. And again, I could do a whole speech on narrative identity. There's lots of different parts of it, but psychologists also look at how coherent the story is. They look at, if somebody tells me a story about their life, for example, they'll often ask, tell me a low point in your life, maybe write a few paragraphs, tell me a high point, tell me a turning point, right? They just often get people to pick out big events in their life, and they'll measure how coherent that story was. Did it seem to make sense? So again, I love this quote from Roy Baumeister. People derive meaning in life partly by crafting a story in which the present is explained both as a product of past events and as a springboard for future states towards which they're striving. So you can think of it in terms of, does your life narrative seem to follow a clear road, right? Who I was in the past, who I am now, who I'm going to be in the future. And of course, it's going to be a weaving road, but is it joined together in some way rather than just being disparately random events happening all over the place? This is a paper actually published literally a few months ago. I thought it was really interesting. The researchers asked people about what they called future self continuity. Don't worry too much about that word. Essentially, it was the overlap between how they felt now as a person and how they think they will be, or the type of person they think they'll be in 10 years from now. And so you can kind of think of it as like the more overlap of the two circles, the higher your self continuity, the further they are, the less you think you'll be like you are now in 10 years. And they found in a couple of studies that the more people rated this continuity, so the closer those circles overlapped, the more they rated their life as meaningful. And they even manipulated it in one study where they got one group to write about how they're going to be similar in 10 years to themselves now. And then they've got another control group who didn't write about, they wrote about something else. And again, the group that wrote about how similar they will be in 10 years from now reported more meaning compared with the control group who reported less meaning in life. So I think that's a really interesting idea, just looking at how this sense of coherence in our story can contribute to us feeling life is meaningful. Now, some people think, well, isn't growth a good thing? Why do I want to be the exact same person I am now in 10 years' time? And it's a really good point, because growth is important. And in fact, like we saw before, growing from something is a really important part of meaning. But I want to go through a few examples of how you can feel coherent in your story and your life narrative that isn't about not growing. So it's not that we're not growing, but there are other things that we can do. So researchers call one of them causal coherence. We saw this in the traumatic section. So we want events in the past to feel like they led to something in our future. And again, it's coming back to that idea that life's not random. So you might, for example, say, I went through a difficult time, but it led me to where I am today. So I interviewed somebody in my research, and he was saying that he did a bachelor's degree in commerce, and then he ended up working for a year and then think it's not for me. And now he's back at uni and he's like, I spent a lot of time being angry that I wasted that time. But actually then he started working out that he'd grown and learned a lot from that experience, even though he didn't, get a job from it. We can also have what psychologists call thematic coherence. So this is about finding a theme in our life. And again, we can come back to our values. What values are joining together our life? So for example, you might be a curious person. It might be one of your values is that you really value curiosity. And you might say, well, I was curious when I was at school. I was curious when I was at work. I'm curious in my hobbies that I do. And so, I'm probably a good example of that. I was quite different 20 years ago when I was in high school, but I have always been very curious. I've always had a high level of intrinsic motivation to pursue things that I'm interested in. So I can see a theme in my life, even though my life is pretty different now than it was 20 years ago. And lastly, we can do what's also called meaning making, which is learning a lesson or changing from a specific event. So you might say, after that experience, I learned how valuable my friends are, and I stopped taking them for granted. So I think these are just some really good examples of how we can think about life, even if we haven't been through any traumatic events, as making sense and being coherent. And the last one, a sense of significance, sometimes called mattering, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. So significance is really about feeling valuable. It's about feeling worthy and important. And we want to feel that our existence matters in this world. So we can feel that we matter to ourselves. We can think that, yeah, I value myself. Again, that's a feeling of self-esteem. We can feel that we matter to other people, that somebody cares about us. We can feel that we matter to a higher power, like a God, or we can even feel that we matter to future generations. What I'm doing now will be important to other people, even if they're not alive yet. Now, this is the least researched part of this trifecta. Psychologists have done very little research into actually exactly what leads to a sense of significance or mattering. So kind of what I'm going to talk about here is going to be grabbing little bits of different theories. But interestingly, it might be the most important one, because a study a couple of years ago, they gave questionnaires to people that measured each of these three ones, so purpose, coherence, and what they call mattering. And they also gave a fourth questionnaire, which just asked people general questions. Do you think your life is meaningful? So they called this just general meaning in life. And they found that the only one that consistently predicted general sense of meaning was mattering. So what that means is potentially the average person, when they think about meaning, what they're thinking about is this sense of significance. yet we don't know much about it really as psychologists. So if anyone gets interested in this area, this is one of the three that you could do a lot of work in. So is significance just another myth? Is it just another illusion? Do we need to feel special even though we're not special? Do we want to feel unique even though we're not unique? We're just one of 8 billion people. Do we need to feel that we matter in the grand scheme of things? So our existentialist friend Albert Camus would probably say, yeah, you're not special. We're not unique. And Roy Baumeister also would kind of agree in a sense. Again, I love this quote. By the way, I tell my students don't overuse quotes, direct quotes, but if you can't say it better than the author, then it's fine. So I couldn't say it better than him. A person wants his or her life to make an interesting or inspiring story, to exemplify a high theme or lesson, or to be part of a grand and important development. Interest in the deeper mysteries of life may simply reflect the idle hope that all of this has some profound, lasting importance. That hope, the hope that it can be understood, and what's more, that it's worth taking the trouble to figure it out. So when we think about whether we are significant, even though we probably aren't in the grand scheme of things, this might be a bit of an illusion, but it is an important illusion. And I think some really interesting research from psychology, and this is a whole different area to meaning in life, but it certainly overlaps, is a research from social psychology looking at how people enhance their own sense of self. So when we ask people about, to estimate your confidence in certain things, they always overestimate stuff. They will overestimate their abilities. There's a famous study that found that 90% of drivers rate themselves as better than average. They'll overestimate the level of control they think they have over the world, and they'll overestimate how much they think the future will turn out well for them. So they're overly optimistic. So in a sense, this self-enhancement is kind of a feeling that we're super unique. I'm special. I'm different to everyone else. Everyone else is average, but I'm unique. And what's very interesting is that researchers have found what they call depressive realism, which is essentially the idea that people with depression don't have these illusions. People with depression are actually pretty objective and realistic in measuring themselves, which I think is an indication potentially, like we saw at the start, that depression is a lack of meaning. It's not feeling significant, and it's probably not feeling purposeful or coherent either. So we can't talk about significance without talking about a very influential book by Ernst Becker, who The Denial of Death, and he wrote this book back in the 1970s. And he said that humans have a need to feel cosmically special, or cosmic specialness, because of our death anxiety. So essentially, he made the very grim point that humans are kind of halfway between gods and animals. We have the body of an animal. It's going to decay and die, but we have the mind of a god. We can think about that. We're the only animal that can think and that we're going to die. We can actually think, I'm not going to exist in the future. And he said that gives us terror. We are terrified and very anxious at this thought. And so he said we need to create what he called immortality projects to make ourselves feel more unique and special. So he said that a lot of people do things like fight wars and get monuments built and do scientific discoveries because they want to do something that's going to outlast themselves. It's going to outlast their body once it dies. Another quote, they earn this feeling by carving, so the feeling of specialness, by carving out a place in nature, by building an edifice that reflects human value, a temple, a cathedral, a totem pole, a skyscraper, a family that spans 3 generations. The hope and belief is that the things that man creates in society are of lasting worth and meaning, that they outlive or outshine death and decay, that man and his products count. And in psychology, so this is a very influential book, but in psychology, there's been a lot of research in a theory called terror management theory, which is essentially inspired by his work, and they wanted to try and test it empirically. And there's hundreds of studies now in this that have found that when you get people to very subtly think about their death, you get them to write about it, briefly about how they might die in the future, they will typically double down on their identity. They'll become more closely affiliated with their nation. They'll be more affiliated with their religion, and they'll also boost their self-esteem. So potentially by getting people to think about their death, they are trying to make themselves feel more special and like they're going to live longer in the world. So all of this talk of specialness and uniqueness and how we want to feel so special in this world, is feeling the opposite maybe good as well? Is feeling insignificant a good thing? So that's a famous picture, the pale blue dot, the picture of Earth from millions of miles away from an autonomous satellite. this tiny, tiny little speck of dust in a sunbeam. Nature going out and looking at giant trees and mountains that have been there for thousands of years or hundreds of years. And of course, religious experiences where we feel some higher presence bigger than us. So there is some research looking at this that actually exposure to nature, so most of this research is about time in nature, does actually give us some benefits as well. So it shifts our attention from the sense of self to this ego to the bigger picture. So we feel a sense of awe. We can also feel this feeling of self-transcendence. So again, it's that I'm connected to something more than just my individual self. And again, there's quite a bit of research showing that feeling small in the face of big things like this can lead people to feel more humility. They're more pro-social, so they're more likely to be nice to each other. They have less daily stress, probably because they can, see that the daily stresses aren't that important. But of course, this does come along with fear and anxiety. So there are some negative feelings, of course, feeling tiny, but it can be positive for us as well. So one thing I want to point out here, just to get technical for a moment, is that when we talk about measuring these things, psychologists, we're talking about using questionnaires. It's how most psychology research is done, by asking people questions. And psychologists are still not sure exactly about the questions we ask when we talk about significance or mattering. So we've kind of used those words interchangeably. Up until last year, a paper by Frank Martella and Mike Steger again, they actually realized, well, hang on, maybe we're asking the wrong questions. Because most of the questionnaires had asked questions about what they called mattering, which was this idea that you matter in the big scheme of things. So this is some of the questions. Even 1,000 years from now, it would still matter whether I existed or not. Even considering how big the universe is, I can say my life matters. I don't know about you, but I would answer pretty low on those. I'd say, no, my life doesn't matter in that big. No one's going to know me in 1,000 years, and that's okay. So they thought, well, hang on, what about, and they called it significance, so they used this other word. What about just feeling valuable in your own life to other people? My life is full of value. This is some of the questions they use. Every day I experience a sense that life is worth living. And they realized that when they gave this to people, these two questionnaires, actually there was they used a statistical model, and they found that there was differences in how people answered. So potentially mattering is not just this broad sense of I matter in the big scheme of things, but we can also feel significant just individually as well. So again, a lot more work needs to be done. This literally was published late last year, so we're just starting to figure out how to ask the right questions. And I'll finish on this section by just a reminder that, yes, feeling significant might be an illusion, but it is a good illusion, right? It's positive. It helps us to feel really good. And we don't have to feel that cosmic significance. Like I was just saying, we can feel significant just by helping other people, contributing to shaping the next generation, or even just living in line with our own personal values. If you can do that, you can still feel a sense of significance, even if you're not going to be the next Einstein or the next Galileo. So that's the three different elements of meaning in life. Hopefully that's kind of made a bit more sense. Really interesting, though, is that even though they're separate, they are very much overlapping. They're not completely unique. So we actually see that when each of these three elements can have a pretty big impact on one another. So for example, coherence can often lead to significance. If we can make sense of our lives, that might be a prerequisite to actually feeling valuable and worthwhile. So a famous quote by Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. Purpose might lead to significance. Having a sense that you've got something to do, again, might make you feel like you're worthy and valuable. It's a reason to get out of bed. Coherence might lead to purpose. Without coherence, it might be hard to find a sense of purpose because you can't make sense of your own life. So how are you supposed to make sense of what you're going to do in the future? And purpose, the other way around, might lead to coherence. If you have a purpose, if you know what you're doing, that might make you a bit clearer about your life right now, or understand what I'm meant to be doing, right? So I've made sense of it. So each of these three elements, they very much do relate to one another. All right, does anyone either online, you can pop it, I think you can pop it in the chat box, can't you, Cassie, or anyone here? What was the first thing that you came to your mind when I asked what gives your life meaning, if you want to share? Anyone? Pretty personal topic. Happy if your work gives you meaning? Oh. Someone's work gives them meaning. Yep. Yeah.
Family, protecting nature, a lot of family and relationship.
Yep. Yep. Family, relationship, protecting nature, work. A dog. Yeah. My dogs give my life meaning. Children. Anyone on campus want to?
Sport.
Sport. Yeah.
Community.
Community. Lovely.
Connections.
Connections. Yeah. Sorry, who said that? Yeah. Connections. To people, do you mean?
To people, to universe, to animals.
Yep, yep.
Pretty much every existential being.
Yep. Lovely. Thank you for everybody sharing. So when we do talk, I'll rush through this a bit. We've got a lot to, I don't want to go over. When we do talk about sources of meaning, as we just saw, one of the most common things that people talk about that gives their life meaning is relationships, connections, whether it's to other humans or other living beings. So friendship, love, sense of belonging, contributing to other people. Relationships is almost consistently the top that gives people a sense of meaning. But the opposite of that, engagement, just having fun, being part of life, getting in there, immersing yourself in life, enjoying it, appreciating it. This is the philosopher I talked about before, Albert Camus. He wrote a very depressing essay that life is meaningless, and his final answer was actually just immerse yourself, just have fun, and that's meaningful. Self-actualization is another thing people often talk about. So this is really using our abilities to really fully realize our potential. So, using your skills, your values, your strengths to engage yourself, whether it's in sport, in work. Work gives people a lot of sense of meaning, that's for sure. And again, the opposite, self-transcendence. So committing to something larger than the self. And some researchers use this distinction. I like it, vertical self-transcendence, which is more like spirituality, people above me or something above me, or horizontal self-transcendence. So that's about dedicating ourselves to something within this world. So a cause, contributing, generativity, which is a psychological term meaning helping the next generation. And order is another one people often talk about. So feelings of, that following their tradition, being, their morals, and of course, as we've talked about a million times, people's values. So I want to end on, hopefully I'm not going to go too far over, it's pretty good timing, my own research, but I don't want to do this just because I'm going to toot my own horn, but actually I think it's a really good way to get some of these really abstract concepts I've been talking about and make them concrete, make them something that you can actually do yourself or give to a client. So I did my research on what I called life crafting, which essentially was an intervention to help people find more meaning. And we had 5 elements. I'll go into those elements in more detail in a moment. But essentially, we got people to reflect and write about these 5 elements. So it was a writing intervention that they did. We suggested, we theorized, I guess, that by doing this, that would satisfy the basic psychological needs that we talked about. So autonomy, confidence, and relatedness. And by doing that, that would also then make them feel that their life was more meaningful and authentic. So you can see in those 5 elements, and again, I'll go through them. We've got values, exploration, thinking about your interests, self-concordant goals, which again was essentially goals based on values and interests, thinking about a coherent life narrative, and thinking about your relationships. So in those top ones, that's going to give us a sense of purpose, or it's going to be related, hopefully, to purpose. Obviously, coherent life narrative is going to be related to coherence, but also our values. Remember, we thought about a theme of our life, and our values can be one of those themes. And our relationships and contribution is going to be significance. And again, values. So I always come back to values. I think they're so important when we talk about meaning. And we found at the end of the intervention that people rated more higher levels of meaning in life, as well as higher levels of those basic psychological needs. So let me just briefly go through those 5. And again, hopefully these are some practical strategies you can use yourself or give to a client or anyone else. So as I've said a million times, values are so important when we talk about meaning in life. So we getting ourselves or other people to explore what our top values are. So I like to think of them in doing it as either explicit values exploration, or you can do an implicit. So an explicit would literally be, here's a list of values. So we did it online. So people just had a list and they selected them. And, choose your top 10. And then maybe, all right, can we get that down to your top 5? What's the 5? Maybe even your top 3. What are the really top, most important values that you hold? And why is that? What was it about those values that you felt you needed to keep in when all the other ones dropped away. So when I was doing this myself, I kept on, there's a few like curiosity, I knew that was always going to be there, but nature, I kept on coming back to nature. I was like, I can't get rid of that. So even in my top 3, nature had to be there. And it really clarified to me something I always knew, which was that helping nature, being a part of nature, you know, being around animals, all of that was one of my top values. If you want to do it in person, these kind of value cards are really good. So you can literally give people a card deck and they play on it and sort it through. It's literally just looks like that, where it's got one value on each card. But you also do an implicit values exercise. So you can do this in different ways, but a common one is to ask people, what would you like people to say at your funeral? And I guarantee you no one will ever answer that question by saying, well, I want people to say how big my house was and how fast my car was and how much money I earned, right? They're going to say, I want people to say I was a kind person. I want them to remember me as fun. I want them to remember me as energetic or whatever. And so they're talking about their values. So again, you get them to implicitly get there, but it's the same thing. They're talking about what they find most deeply important to them and then reflecting on it. Why? What made you choose that? Why did those ones come up and not other ones? But it's not just about what we value. It's about what gives us, you know, makes our life fun. What do we find interesting? What are we passionate about? What do we do just for the sake of it? Doesn't matter whether anyone's watching, doesn't matter what it does for the world, just what gives us a sense of fun. So I've got a bunch of pictures of hobbies and fun things we can do. And again, there's lots of activities you can do around this, but you could ask people, what do they love doing for their own sake? But then how much time do they have? So, you know, you can rate every activity that you've listed as A, I do it all the time, B, I sometimes do it, and C, I never have time to do it. And then how might we turn some of the B's and C's into A's? How might we find more time in our life to do the things that we just love doing? So then we can also think about goal setting. How do we, what do we want to be doing in the next 1 to 5 years from now? What role might the values and interests we just talked about play in those life goals? And we can think about that along different areas, such as the work you'd like to be doing, the relationships you'd like to have, the leisure activities and hobbies you'd like to do, and the health activities that you'd like to do. And then we can turn them into concrete plans. What kind of short-term specific goals can you set for yourself that's going to start working towards these broader goals? So again, we're coming back to that sense of competence. It's not so broad and scary. And a lot of people said this in my research when we asked them about this intervention. They said the values were really good because they're nice and broad and they made me understand what I value. But doing this kind of more concrete goal setting helped me feel like it actually achieved these things rather than feeling like, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed with all of the possibilities. Next, we did a coherent life narrative exercise. We did a couple. So there's not much research in this. So I kind of started asking my participants, you know, what kind of exercises would be good and what kind of things they did. And so there's still a lot of research needed in how to stimulate this in an intervention. But what I did too. So I gave them what we call a narrative technique. So this is where you think about your life as a book. What chapters are in your book? You know, which ones have gone? What chapter are you currently in now? What might move you from this chapter to the next chapter? What characters are there in your book? What, you know, are there themes across those chapters? And again, we're trying to get that coherence that their life does follow some kind of theme. We also did what's called a growth-oriented technique. We've talked about growth a couple of times. Growth is getting people to think about what experiences have you been through, especially negative ones that you may not have enjoyed, but what did you learn from it? What did you take away from it? So again, that example of the student that did a bachelor's degree, felt like he wasted it, but he came to the realization he'd actually really gotten a lot from it that helped his life. And then lastly, this is probably the broadest one, and putting a lot of this into action is going to be the problem, but still just reflecting on it is important, is your relationships, like we talked about, very, very important for a sense of meaning in life. So we got people to think about who's important in your life, why are they important, how do they support you, how can you support them? But we also got them to think about how might they contribute to life and other people more broadly. So could you help people? Could you volunteer? Could you, you know, even how might your job in the future, this was mostly students we were talking with, how might your job in the future contribute to giving back to society? And, you know, it doesn't have to be the classic example of somebody volunteering. You know, it can be a doctor or a teacher, or so many jobs contribute to society in some way. So that's just an overview of the research I did and the intervention that we came up with. Hopefully that's given you a couple of practical ideas of how to turn these broad ideas into something that you could actually use yourself. And I wanted to finish with a lovely quote by, again, Irvin Yalom. This is from his book we talked about earlier. I can't rave enough about that book. If you've got the time, it's dense, but it is a really worthwhile book. Oh, I can't read that under that bit. Anyway, engagement is a therapeutic answer to meaninglessness, regardless of the latter's source. Wholehearted engagement in any of the infinite array of life's activities not only disarms the galactic view, but enhances the possibility of one's completing the patterning of the events of one's life in some coherent fashion. To find a home, to care about other individuals, about ideas or projects, to search, to create, to build. These and all other forms of engagement are twice rewarding. They're intrinsically enriching, and they alleviate the dysphoria that stems from being bombarded with the unassembled brute data of existence. One must immerse oneself in the river of life and let the question drift away. So thank you, everybody. I'll finish up there.
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. Fantastic talk. Listening to that as a psychology professor sort of jumps out at me that you start with a highly philosophical question. You know, what is the meaning of life? Question that's, been important to theologians, philosophers, artists, novelists, poets, musicians throughout history. And you pivot that into something that scientific psychology can look at.
Yep.
And we can use the methods, the techniques that scientific psychology has developed and develop an evidence base around that. It's a question that psychology will never answer because philosophy can't answer it, but we can take elements of it and convert it. So I think that's a really lovely thing, and to see it. I'm a bit surprised that it hasn't been more research, that it's relatively new in the area.
Yeah.
But that's great that you're on the
It's
cutting edge. All that sort of
starting
stuff.
to pick up a lot, but it's pretty
No, that's wonderful. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes for some Q&A. We're actually going to start with the online Q&A. So Cassie, could you sort of cherry pick a few questions and read them out to us, please?
By the way, I was just going to say, for people taking notes, we'll send you all of these slides, and if anyone wants to nerd out further, there are references to all of the things I've talked about.
There we go.
So you can
Do I need to
follow up.
repeat, do I need to repeat these, Cassie, so people can hear them online?
Possibly.
Okay. Okay. Yep.
Angie.
Yep.
Wanting to know, is there something, Andrew, you are still wondering about significance that you hope research will come to answer to direct my own research questions, discussions?
That is a good question. Probably just what leads to a sense of significance, I guess, more than anything else. If anyone online didn't hear that, just about talking about significance being very under-researched in this area, and what I think needs to be researched. Probably the antecedents, what causes people to feel significant. So we looked at some of the things about the outcomes of feeling significant, that you want to feel like you're going to live past your death and that kind of stuff. But we don't really know why some people feel more significant than others. And so kind of the beforehand, what causes significance is probably a question that I'd want to ask. So now that we're starting to get some good questionnaires that are starting to pick apart exactly what we mean, that I was talking about the paper from last year, we could use that and start measuring just a bunch. You could probably do something even at ACAP, just give people the significance questionnaire and then give them a bunch of other psychology questions and see what predicts significance. That would probably be a pretty interesting route.
Cassie, what we might do is we might sort of alternate between on here and online. You can go through and maybe select out a couple of the questions you think might be a bit more relevant. So anybody in the audience have a question for her? Yes.
Might be semantics here, but how do you think about beliefs in the context of this topic?
Beliefs in what? In specific
Someone's beliefs, I don't mean religious beliefs, just what they believe. Do you relate it more to values, or how do you think about that?
I mean, I suppose that would come under some of the assumptions we were talking about, those kind of almost, I mean, beliefs can be conscious, but they can be unconscious as well about how you how you feel about life. But they would certainly be values as well. Definitely, if you're more conscious of them, you're more aware of them, then your beliefs would be what you value. So I definitely think values would be probably the underlying factor. I've certainly seen beliefs and values used a bit interchangeably. So it probably is a bit of semantics in there, but yeah, I guess that would be my answer.
We'll go back to another online question, Cassie, if you've got one there that you want
So
to.
Brandon is doing his honours on terror management theory.
Mhm.
And he's wanting to know, Andrew, how much you believe death plays a part of meaning, or if you believe these meaning-making models occur largely outside the cognition of death.
That's a deep question. I'm not 100, so that area on significance was, like I said, kind of pulled together from lots of theories because there isn't much within this positive psychology field. So I'm not 100%, I'm not deep in the terror management theory research. I mean, I think death plays a part in meaning for sure. Being aware of our death is going to make us feel like we want to be more significant. We want to hold on to the things that are valuable. There's actually something I ended up cutting out just because it might have taken too long, but there's a lot of research on trauma survivors again, but not in the coherent sense, but in the significant sense. People that go through traumatic experiences that are almost died, close to death, do find themselves having that post-traumatic growth and really not taking life for granted anymore. And so definitely there's a relationship between a kind of awareness of death and feeling meaningful. But I think certainly there's lots and lots of ways we can experience meaning without death being involved in it.
Yes, I'll come back to you next time. Yep.
Do you think there would be a relationship between how securely attached a person is and their sense of significance and mattering?
That's a good question. I imagine there would be, yeah. I definitely think a sense of trying to think if there's any, I don't think there's been any research specifically looking at that relationship, but I imagine there would be. I imagine if you feel connected and really close and secure, you're
And
probably
internalize that sense of
yeah. Exactly. I have a sense of, I mean, when we talk about significance, we're really talking similar to self-esteem. It's that like, I'm worthy, I'm worth, someone caring about me. So I'd imagine there would be a pretty close relationship with that.
Got another online question, Cassie?
Yeah, there's so many. This
Yep.
one's had quite a lot of upvoting and it's got some incredibly psychology words. Apologize if I get them wrong. So it's from Thomas. He's loved the research topic tonight. In the context of meaning making, how does the brain's neural circuitry, particularly areas like the prefrontal cortex and limbic system, respond to experiences imbued with positive meaning?
Oh dear.
I don't know then. I don't,
As well.
Yeah. I don't know how much. I'm not across the neuropsychology side of meaning in life. Side note, I don't think there is much neuropsychology in the meaning of life yet. So again, a really great area if anyone has access to fMRI machines to do that.
Yeah.
So I don't think ACAP has the funding for that.
No,
but
not quite.
that's certainly an area that would be good to do research, but I actually don't think there is. Not at least not in the sense of the meaning literature I'm talking about here. There might be something tangentially related that I'm unaware of, but I don't think there's actually been any neuropsychology literature related to meaning in life in this sense. So that would be interesting. We often have to work out the basics first before we then start doing really biological research. But I think we're getting close enough to really understanding this topic that we can start doing some neurological research. But I'm not aware of any that has done that yet.
Okay. Yes.
Great presentation, Andrew. Do you have a sense of the sort of size of effect size from a life crafting intervention, and then also how enduring that is compared to other interventions to promote meaning in life?
That's a good question. So the effect size for the life crafting, so for non-psychology people and stats people, effect size is just a way of measuring how much of an impact it was, because you could find something statistically significant that's minuscule and useless. So effect size can be small, medium, large. We found a medium effect, so it's 0.5, but it was a small sample size. So it was a pilot study. We're just kind of getting some ideas going. So a lot more research needs to be done. Compared to other interventions, it's hard to do that because one thing I wanted to do was make a comprehensive meaning in life intervention. There's not really anything like that out there. It's a lot of the interventions are kind of hodgepodge made up in the moment, usually done in hospitals for people dying of cancer. And then they're great, but they're not really based in theory. There's nothing multidimensional. There's often purpose-based interventions, but there's nothing with it. So it's hard to kind of compare it to other things because there's not really anything, not to, again, toot my own horn, but there's not much research in interventions like this.
Okay.
So a lot more research, again, needs to be done and on bigger samples.
Cassie, an online question?
Yeah, some of these are very.
Have a look at Cassie.
look overwhelmed.
She's just exasperated.
She's
now.
earning a
She should come to a psychology lecture. You want to be exasperated. Come along to one of
she's
the
earning a
lectures.
paycheck tonight.
Yeah.
We said, thank you very much for this enlightening talk. Does the meaning of life change as we grow and experience new things, or as we achieve new goals, like how Maslow's hierarchy of needs shift as we move up the pyramid towards self-actualization? Is life ultimately a continuous search for meaning?
Oh, the developmental trend.
I will answer the
Yeah.
last question with yes. I think life is always about meaning. I mean, I touched on this in purpose, but the other two, sorry, are absolutely relevant. You never achieve the purpose, you never achieve meaning, and you go, great, my life's meaningful, I'm done. So I think you're always doing it. I don't really love Maslow's hierarchy. It's not very well supported by the literature, and I don't think you move up it in a linear fashion. So you can get to self-actualization quickly. You don't have to go through all of these other steps to get there. And as we saw, self-actualization really is, and I also don't like that word because it's really meaningless. No one really knows what it means, and psychologists don't either. But if probably the best description is that it's using your talents to your best potential. And we talked about that as one of the sources of meaning. So it's not so much about getting to self-actualization and being, yes, I'm at the top of the pyramid and I'm, life's done. But it's, yes, certainly using our abilities, using our strengths to the best of our ability, and achieving goals and having a purpose. That's definitely going to be relevant to meaning. So I hope that kind of addresses the question.
Yeah. Okay, yes.
I just have a question more about your research. So I saw that it's specifically around youth,
Yes.
and you said that there was already a positive correlation between searching for meaning and youth. Would these interventions work across the entirety of the lifespan? And is that something that you're looking into, if that's a consistent change? And do life transitions then change our meaning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yes, so my research looked at what we call in psychology emerging adults, which is kind of the term we use for people that are legally adults, but they're not. They're like, it's 18 to, used to be 25 now, we've pushed it to 29 because people are taking longer to grow up. But eventually people that are legally adults, but are still very much not achieving all of the milestones. People aren't getting married at 20 anymore, they're getting married at 30. So I looked at emerging adults, and I would say life crafting is probably best for them because they are in that period of searching, and it is something that they may not have landed on yet. Is it useful at all stages? In theory, I think yes. It's probably less useful for, maybe that midlife period. But again, famously, people go through midlife crises, and so maybe it is great. There's also some research similar at the end of life where people do a life review. So it's almost life crafting, but in reverse, I guess. So I'd probably say it's less effective in that sense because it is very much future focused. But yeah, I think most effective at adolescents and young adults. Possibly less effective when people are older, but again, it will depend on what they're going through. Like you said, if you're going through a life transition, that's actually probably going to be a really good time to do something like that. Yeah.
Right. An online question, Cassie?
I guess question/statement. Jackie said, you mentioned relationships, but I was surprised the word love wasn't mentioned. And often it is cited as the answer, i.e. to be loved, feel loved, love other.
I think it was on the slides under the sources of meaning. I think I put relationships and then so all of those things. It's kind of a catch-all term. We use the word relatedness, connection, belonging, love. It's all kind of the same feeling that you are loved by someone and you love them back and you belong to a group with them. So it's all kind of the same thing, I guess.
We'll take one more question from the audience and one more online. Yes.
What is your question after completing the study that you want to answer next?
Oh. You always have to end on the hard one.
It sounds like an academics question, doesn't it? Yeah, yeah, and you do think, yeah, now what would you have done different?
Yeah.
That sort of stuff, yeah.
I want to know more. So I think the purpose literature is pretty well studied. There's a lot of stuff there. I'd like to know a bit more about how people make sense of their life, irrespective of traumatic events. So like I said, the narrative literature there's a bit of that, but there's not much. So I think there's a lot of research on how people make sense of their life when bad things happen, but not how do we make sense of our life just in general. And do we need to do that? Is that helpful? Even if you're just sailing along and everything's good, is it useful to be coherent? So I think we need to know a bit more about that. I'd like to do more of my life crafting research, but on bigger populations. So we talked a bit about that before, larger sample, longitudinal. Does it have an impact across time? Is it useful for different age groups? So intervention wise, there's a lot. We've really only started doing meaningful theory-based interventions in the last 5 years in terms of this meaning stuff. So I think intervention might be my other answer is, can we foster it? Can we help people? Can we boost their sense of meaning? And my research, like I said, was a pilot study. It was really just trying to get some ideas going, a little bit of statistical work, but certainly needs a lot bigger stuff to happen.
Okay, great. And one final question from online, Cassie?
Yeah, it's more of a statement, I guess, but Pamela's saying the old cultures had many ideas in this area that you presented on. The Western rationalists have maybe created a barren space for humans around meaning. Do you feel looking towards the older ways could bring value?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Certainly looking at not necessarily older ways, I would say, but different cultures. I think there's absolutely value in looking at the different cultures. And we also have to think about, belonging and feeling that we matter is going to be partly based in our culture. So if you feel like you belong to your culture, that's going to be really meaningful. So I think different cultures will have different answers. And if you feel like you're living one culture's life when you actually want to be living in a different culture's life, then yeah, that's going to have a pretty negative impact. So unfortunately, like a lot of psychology research, it is done in Western countries, and we need a bit more of this research from other cultures. So absolutely, I'd say there's value in researching different cultures. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Look, we'll draw to questions to a close there. We do have, if people do want to follow up either on the online audience or here with Andrew, I'm sure he'd be very welcome to receive your emails. It's a very simple one, like all ACAP, it's just a person's name, andrew.napier@acap.edu.au, or you can just Google him at ACAP website, you'll find him. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer. We've got some refreshments in the lobby if you want to hang around and have a chat. I don't know whether Andrew can hang around a little while longer and have a chat. Yeah, he's happy to hang around.
Doors are closing.
What time we got to be out?
This is finished.
Oh, once this is finished. So we can sort of mill around for a little bit.
Hang out on
We
the street and chat.
got to get out. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. See, I'm used to working out of Bundoora where you can just hang around, as long as you like and nobody cares. But certainly if people do want to follow up with Andrew with any questions, I'm sure he'd welcome your emails with any questions you might have. Please be on the lookout for other alumni and industry events that are happening throughout the year. And please just join with me in thanking Andrew for a wonderful presentation tonight.